External Affairs here at CAP. We know that we have a uniquely American gun problem. 33,000 people in this country are killed with guns every year. There is not one cause of this violence, nor sadly is there one single solution. As a nation, we have been forced to respond and react to a number of mass shootings over the last year, including one just this past weekend in Kalamazoo County, Michigan. Unfortunately, as the President has noted, our response to these incidents has become routine. But as the horrific details of the massacre at the Emmanuel AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina on June 17th came to light, it quickly became clear that this was not an episode of random mass violence. This was a hate crime. This was an attack by a white supremacist on a historic black church and its congregants, a church known as Mother Emanuel, that is home to the largest and oldest black congregation in the South. This wasn't the first mass shooting in recent history motivated by hate. In August 2012, a white supremacist attacked a Sikh temple in Oak Creek, Wisconsin, fatally shooting 6 people and injuring 4 others. And I'd like to take a moment to recognize the mayor of Oak Creek, Steve Scafati, who is joining us today. Welcome. And examples of hate-motivated individuals terrorizing communities with guns are not limited to these high-profile cases that involve multiple victims. Violent extremists and hate criminals often use guns as a tool to threaten and intimidate members of historically vulnerable communities. In a new report CAP is releasing today, we attempted to find out just how often guns are used in the commission of hate crimes. The number should stop us cold. Between 2010 and 2014, there were roughly 43,000 hate crimes committed in the United States that used the use or threat of a gun. And I want to recognize the work of our gun policy team in putting together this important report and bringing attention to this issue. Thank you. Hate crimes have a pernicious impact on the targeted communities, not just the most immediate victim of a particular crime, but the broader community of which this victim is a member. The use of a gun in these cases escalates this harm. The threat of a gun by a dangerous extremist sends a clear message that they not only harbor feelings of bias or hate against a particular group, but they are willing to kill in service of that ideology. A common theme in all of our work on gun violence prevention policy is to enact laws and policies that help keep guns out of the hands of the wrong people, out of the hands of people who have demonstrated that they pose an increased risk to community safety. Certainly, people who have been convicted of a hate crime fall into that category. That's why in our report today, we are proposing a new policy idea: enact legislation that closes a loophole and bars individuals who have been convicted of hate crimes, both felonies and misdemeanors, from being able to buy and possess guns. And I also want to acknowledge Congressman Cicilline, who is here with us today. He's a tireless advocate for so many in this country from the great state of Rhode Island, who is taking a leadership position on this incredibly important issue. We recognize that this proposal won't prevent all hate-motivated shootings, but it would be a strong step forward towards keeping guns out of the hands of people who have proven themselves to be uniquely dangerous to the safety of certain communities. I'm pleased to be here welcoming you all to this great panel discussion today, not only because I think it's an important topic, but it's also one that's deeply personal for me. I spent more than a decade working on the issue of hate crimes, particularly as those incidents impact the LGBT community. For 12 years after the murders of Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr., we worked to strengthen the federal law to better protect individuals from hate crimes. We built a coalition of more than 300 organizations, had more than 1 million calls, emails, and faxes, I think you remember faxes, sent to the Hill, and had 14 floor votes before ultimately sending this bill to the president's desk. And President Obama signed that bill into law. Today we're discussing how the issue of hate crimes, and one that has historically posed political challenges, how that intersects with gun violence, also an issue that is currently mired in partisan politics and gridlock. But it's an intersection that's just too important to ignore, which is why I'm looking forward to today's conversation. Thank you all so much for being here, and please join me in welcoming our panel to the stage, as well as our moderator, Vice President of Gun and Crime Policy here at CAP, Chelsea Parsons. Please come up to the
Want to slide that one?
Over.
All right, I'm gonna have to speak in.
Either way.
Vault over the table. Good morning.
Morning.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here on this lovely February morning in Washington. And thank you to our panelists who had to travel to be here. My name is Chelsea Parsons. I'm the Vice President for Guns and Crime Policy here at CAP. And I'm really pleased to be here and to see you all here this morning. I want to quickly just introduce who I have joining me this morning, and then we'll get right into the discussion. Congressman David Cicilline represents the 1st District of Rhode Island. Prior to that was the mayor of Providence, Rhode Island. And as Winnie mentioned, has been a longstanding champion of both of the issues that we're talking about today, gun violence prevention and eliminating discrimination, particularly as it impacts the LGBT community. Steve Hawkins is a longstanding advocate for civil and human rights. Most recently, Steve was the executive director of Amnesty International, and prior to that was an executive vice president at the NAACP. Welcome, good morning. We're joined by Mark Potok, a senior fellow at the Southern Poverty Law Center and one of the nation's leading experts on hate groups and violent extremism. Good morning and welcome. And finally, we're joined by Mayor Steve Scafidi from Oak Creek, Wisconsin. Thank you very much for being here. And Mayor, I want to start with you, if I may. So you were thrust into this issue of hate crimes and gun violence when just 4 months after you were elected, a white supremacist attacked a Sikh temple in Oak Creek, killing 6 people. Can you talk about how that incident impacted the Oak Creek community, and in particular how the added element of racial and ethnic bias impacted the way the community responded?
Thanks for the question. I mean, as a new mayor, it obviously shocked and stunned me. I can remember August 5th, 2012 so clearly. I have a large garden. I was working in my garden that morning very early, came back home, was sitting on the couch. I get 2 quick calls from fire chief, police chief. First call was, we have a mass shooting. Second call was, we have an officer down. So you can imagine, new to the job, not experiencing these types of things, that's thrown into my lap. So I mean, it sucked the air out of my lungs. But for our community, it was equally shocking because it's a pretty quiet community, not a place where murders happen. Typical, it's 35,000 people. It's one of the largest suburbs of Milwaukee, but very quiet, great police force. So we dealt with that shock. That was the initial thing. But the encouraging thing about it was the way the community came together. 2 days later, on a Tuesday night, and I'll never forget this night, in a public park, and we were still very much lots of tension because we didn't really know a lot of the backstory yet of where this person came from, why he picked that group. We had over 6,000 people came together to listen about the lives of the people that were killed. And this was a brutal crime. These people were in their place of worship, a temple right on our main street, Howell Avenue, and several of them were shot in the back. Paramjit Kaur, who was the one woman killed in the attack, was literally in the prayer hall and shot in the back while she was praying. So those types of things are something we would never expect. So we had to formulate what we were going to do. So our strategy was simple. We wanted to communicate what had happened. We weren't going to shy away from it, and we were. And my goal was to not let that event, the shooting, define what we were about, and we didn't. And we'll probably talk more about that. But it was shocking for us, but we didn't let that be the story. We kind of moved forward after that.
Mark, you have had the pleasure and privilege of being immersed in this issue of hate groups and violent extremism for many, many years. And last week, the Southern Poverty Law Center put out a new report, looking at the current state of hate violence and extremism. Can you talk about some of your findings in your report and give us a little bit of the context of the current moment that we're in terms of hate violence and extremism?
Sure. I mean, this report was looking at, as we do every year, the number. What we do is count groups, count hate groups, and also so-called patriot groups, groups we all used to call militias. And essentially, what we, every year we use these numbers as a kind of way, an index to looking at the size of the movement, what's really happening with it. And basically, the long-range story is that ever since Barack Obama was elected in the fall of 2008, the numbers of these groups have gone up dramatically, especially the militia-type groups. In the case of the militia groups, some 800% in 4 years. It went from about 150 to something like 1,360 in a mere 4 years. The latest year, what we found was, first of all, an extremely high level of violence, of domestic terrorist violence. Most of the cases, probably most people in this room haven't even heard of, because in most cases they were stopped before people died. But of course there was, Chattanooga and Colorado Springs and the unbelievable massacre in Charleston. So people know that at least something was going on. But my colleagues at the ADL did an interesting report showing that at year's end 2015, at least according to their numbers, there had been more people killed by domestic terrorists or by right-wing extremists in this country in the last year than in any year since Oklahoma City, right, when 168 people were murdered. So, basically what the reasons for this growth, which are true in this last year, as true as they have been since Obama was first elected, are a number of things. First of all, there's a lot of rage out there at a black man being elected. But even more than that, there was anger at what that black man represented. In other words, this huge demographic change that is happening in the United States. The idea that whites will lose their majority, or non-Hispanic whites will lose their majority by about 2043. In other words, in less than 30 years, according to the Census Bureau. So that's a kind of underlying thing. Then you have everything that globalization has wrought, right? Large immigrant flows and so on that are kind of challenging in a lot of ways the basis of the society. At the same time, the economy has been very, very tough on people across the board. And in particular, we see an enormous amount of rage and anger in the kind of white working class and white middle class. In other words, the very same demographic, really, that Donald Trump is appealing directly to. There are a number of other things going on. You think of the kind of cultural changes that have happened in this country in just the last few years. The best example, it seems to me, being same-sex marriage, right? I mean, I think 15 years ago, did it seem remotely imaginable that in 50 states same-sex marriage would be legal? And yet it is. So there are all these things going on. And then in the last year, of course, we had the phenomenon of Donald Trump and others, particularly in the Republican presidential primaries, just pouring an incredible amount of vitriol and hate directly into the political mainstream. And this at the very same time that an awful lot of conspiracy theories that originate on the extreme right have been brought into the mainstream also, courtesy of politicians like Ted Cruz and Donald Trump. Just to give a tiny example, I think of the governor of Texas, Greg Abbott, describing or calling on state authorities to keep an eye on the military because people were worried that the Jade Helm military exercise last summer was actually part of a plot to impose martial law in this country. So we're seeing a lot of violence, a lot of intended violence. And one other thing I think I should probably say, because we're talking about hate crimes, and you go to this in your report, but maybe I should just emphasize it. If you look at the FBI national hate crime statistics, you would think that there are somewhere between about 7,000 and 11,500 hate crimes a year. That's what the statistics show from 95 to 2014, which is the data run we have right now. Many of us felt for years that this was vastly understated, the real level of hate crimes in America, and in fact it did. Finally, the Bureau of Justice Statistics did 3 different studies looking in a different way at the numbers, in other words, going right to people and surveying them rather than relying on police reports. And the upshot is that in recent years, the level of hate crimes in America has been more like 250 or 260,000 hate crimes a year. So in other words, there are 25 to 40 times more hate crimes, not percent, times more hate crimes in this country than the FBI statistics would suggest. And if I could just say one final thing.
Please.
You kind of mentioned this, or Winnie, I guess, really mentioned it, but hate crimes, although the number of people who are killed in hate crimes or in domestic terrorism is very small, obviously, compared to cancer deaths or traffic deaths. These kinds of killings, this kind of violence, has a much, much greater impact on communities than other kinds of violence, in the sense that, first of all, if, for instance, you burn a cross on the lawn of the interracial couple in somewhere or other, you are not only targeting those two people, but everyone else similarly situated, every other interracial couple within shouting distance. Also, these crimes tend to fracture communities along pre-existing fault lines of race and class and ethnicity and so on. So they're incredibly destructive. If there were only 5,000 or 10,000 hate crimes a year, it would be an important issue. One is too many, I suppose. But when you're looking at something like 250,000 hate crimes a year, you're looking at a very serious and entrenched social problem.
And Steve, that leads into what I wanted to ask you is, can you talk a little bit about the particular impact that this kind of violence has on communities of color, and historically, situate hate violence and the impact that it's had, particularly on the African American community. And in addition, if you could talk a little bit about how, the shooting in Charleston really did represent more than just another mass shooting that we have to experience in this country.
So Chelsea, to put it in perspective, we've had almost 2 centuries of hate crime against African Americans and other people of color. I mean, the rise of the Ku Klux Klan after the end of the Civil War and the Klan's reign of terrorism throughout the Deep South, and not only impacting African Americans, but Jews and others that the Klan went after. It's important to realize that hate crimes and these actions are meant to be a form of social control, and before the Klan, we certainly had an active period of lynching. And when I mean social control, it's meant, as Mark said, to have a larger impact, a broader impact on a community, changing your patterns of behavior, changing where you decide to live, where you decide to eat, who you decide to marry. And ultimately even impact on where you worship. So looking at what happened at Emmanuel AME, again, this one of the oldest black congregations in the South, and specifically targeted by the perpetrator. And understanding what Wolf said that day as he shot the victims, he talked about, we're tired of you raping our women, we're tired of you taking over our country, and that sentiment, as Mark was pointing out, is growing. So, people compared what happened with Emmanuel to the bombing of the black church back in the 60s. And yes, while things have changed, certainly, the governor of Alabama at the time was a avowed racist compared to Nikki Haley and her background and the response, of course, in South Carolina, the removal of the Confederate flag and an understanding of how these hate symbols play into actions. But it underscored what I fear is that we will see more of these lone wolf kind of killings. We know that 60% thereabouts of the domestic terrorism that takes place takes place with the use of a gun. And as we move towards 2043, these kinds of actions can easily continue. We know that hate crimes are underreported. I think the state of Mississippi in 2014 reported 1 hate crime. And nobody in this room believes that there was only 1 hate crime in Mississippi. So,
thank you.
Yep.
Congressman, so you are here today because you have the answers and the solutions as a member of Congress. We've talked a little bit about the issue of hate crime and violence in this country. And our report today highlights the increasing use of firearms as a tool to commit that violence, and a tool not only to cause lethal violence when the trigger is pulled, but as a tool of fear and intimidation. We've been talking with your office, and I know you've been thinking a lot about these issues, and you're prepared to introduce some legislation. Can you talk about kind of the bill that you're introducing and your thoughts about this issue?
Sure. First, I just want to say thank you to CAP for convening this and for the work that you are doing and for the report you released. And Mark, thank you for your report, and thank you to the panelists. And I think it's important, just quickly before I mention the bill itself, to really talk about the context of this epidemic of gun violence in our country, because it's important to remind people that 31 Americans are murdered every single day in this country with a gun. 55 people kill themselves every single day in this country with a gun. And so the magnitude of this gun violence problem is enormous. And what is particularly alarming is the relationship between guns and hate crimes. And as your report indicates, from 2010 to 2014, about 40,000 hate crimes were committed with a gun. And for all the reasons that were just described about why hate crimes are particularly dangerous and pernicious, because they're not just an attack on an individual and all the harm that goes to that person and that family and all of the related friends and family, but what it means to a larger community. And it's why we have to, I think, pay special attention to this question of how do we reduce hate crimes, and particularly hate crimes that are committed with guns. And what I've tried to do in my work in Congress is really focus on this question of how do we keep guns out of the hands of people who shouldn't have them, criminals and people who have serious mental illness such that having a gun poses a danger to that person or others. Recognizing the vast majority of people who suffer from mental illness never have a gun, are not violent. It's really important to say that. But if you look at mass shootings and you look at the prevalence of people who have serious mental health issues, those are issues. If we could just focus on those, because our opponents are always saying, it's not about law-abiding citizens, it's about keeping the hands of criminals. I say call their bluff. All right, we'll focus on keeping guns out of the hands of criminals and people who shouldn't have them. If we do that successfully, it solves a big part of the problem. Not all of it, but a big part of it. And so this legislation that I'll actually introduce today will require that if you are convicted of a hate crime, of a misdemeanor hate crime, because a felony hate crime is already covered, a misdemeanor hate crime, you will be prohibited from buying or purchasing a gun. One of the reasons it's so important is if you look at the research, there's a pattern of escalation for people who commit hate crimes. They start off by confronting someone that they don't like, whether it's a person who's African American or Jewish, whatever, and then it goes to another step of burning a cross in their front yard, and then it goes, and the escalation can result in obviously the use of a firearm, and with the most deathly of consequences. And so if we have someone who's been convicted of a hate crime with that sort of history of, if you look at the research of escalation, let's stop that person from being able to go into a store and buy a gun or possess a firearm, with the hope that we can prevent that hate crime turning into a great loss of life. So again, I'm sort of calling on my colleagues who say, let's focus on criminals. There are a number of other bills I've introduced that focus on keeping guns out of the hands of criminals. This is one of them, another one. But I think, if we can find some common ground and say, let's all agree that we're going to work hard and figure out how to keep guns out of the hands of people who shouldn't have them.
Thank you for introducing that bill. Mark, could you, the congressman raised this issue of escalating conduct and kind of how many people who engage in violence that's based on hate kind of do tend to start small and escalate. Is that something that you've seen in your research as well?
Yeah, well, really, to be fair, that is the research of Jack Levin and Jack McDevitt at Northwestern University, but it's, I think, clearly true that, there's an escalation process. And, you think of it, Dylan Roof is not a good example because he got his gun legally, but that is just classically so, that, these hate crimes start small. And, I think it's worth mentioning that hate criminals, although to the rest of us they look like the sort of thuggish elements of society, we found that, many hate criminals see themselves as heroes, right? They are standing up for their people, their race, their community, whatever it is. And I have got to say that when somebody like Donald Trump stands in the public square and says, Mexicans are rapists and drug dealers, makes those kinds of statements, or tweets out a Nazi statistics, about black crime against whites, which turned out to be entirely false. That is exactly the kind of signal that goes out to people who are, typically young men who feel angry, and they are essentially getting permission. It's worth remembering that a few weeks after Trump entered the race and made his first speech in which he talked about Mexicans in that way, a mere few weeks later in Boston, a homeless Latino man was beaten up extremely badly with two men with steel pipes, who, when they were arrested, told the cops that they cited Donald Trump. I didn't exactly say, well, he did it because Donald Trump told us to do so, but that was their permission. So I want to emphasize the point that when public figures, people in the public square make these kinds of statements, ultimately it translates into criminal violence. So that's another piece of it, which I don't think the legislation would solve. But in any case, we're in a very tough spot right now. And I just can't emphasize enough that I think, we're looking at 30 more years of this. I mean, ultimately, I feel like, we will come out in a better place. But we're going through a transition as a society that's almost unparalleled, right, in world history. And going from a country that has been 90% white for most of its history, very much dominated by that white group, to a country that's very different, a truly multiracial democracy in which no one group kind of holds the reins.
A little bit about Mark's point. It's probably maybe the only Republican on the panel. It's not a particularly great time to be a Republican. I'm embarrassed by the quality of and the caliber of candidates we have. And I moderated a discussion last week, 300 people, and the subject matter was, what can we learn about Islam? So we brought two members of their faith, and I had this captive audience, overflow crowd of essentially senior citizen white members of a different community than Oak Creek. And they just were fascinated by what they were hearing. But they're getting this dialogue from particularly Donald Trump, who's, frankly, it's terrifying to me as a Republican, and unfortunately seems to be moving forward rather quickly to get the nomination. But he's alarming a community that's really probably never met someone of that faith and had a conversation. So I was overjoyed to see that response. But I'm trying to be a Republican voice when there aren't a lot of Republican voices saying the right things. You said it exactly right. Let's call the bluff, right? So and I get this all the time. I'm very vocal because of what happened, and it's been sort of a mission of my life to talk about it, even though I don't have to. There's certainly a lot of things I could do, other jobs I could do as mayor. But I want to talk about, if you're going to say to me, prosecute the people that commit the crimes, well then I'm going to do that, and I'm going to ask you to fund law enforcement to do that. I'm going to be aggressive about who gets to have a gun if you're a criminal. Those are the things we should be doing. If you're going to say that, then you have to back it up, and that's not happening. And that's why I think the congressman is on the right track here. Go after these folks. They shouldn't have guns. And they will escalate to the point where Mark says they will commit larger events and larger hate crimes that kill more people, and I don't want to see that happen.
And the other thing I wanted to elicit from you as well, in addition to being a Republican mayor, you're a gun owner yourself, and you've talked a lot, especially recently, you've done more talking and speaking about all of these issues and about how, making sure that guns don't fall into the wrong hands is entirely consistent with the Second Amendment. And as a gun owner, you believe that and understand that and kind of understand the importance of that.
All the nuance has gone out of political conversation, right? It's either this way or this way, and there's nothing in the middle. And I think reasonable people would understand that. As a gun owner, I understand there's rights and responsibilities with that ownership of guns. And I think some of the folks that are just saying, that their first response to a mass shooting is, I want to talk about how we want more people to have guns. That is the most insane response to a tragic event that you could ever hear. Yet that's what I'm bombarded with. When the San Bernardino shooting happened, I wrote an op-ed in the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel that said, I've had enough of this. This is ridiculous. And immediately I was attacked by people, personally, email, people came into City Hall and said, how dare you talk about guns? And the whole point of the op-ed was, let's have a real conversation that actually discusses what we can do about this. Otherwise, you're just saying, let people die every day in this country, and I don't care about it. And even as a gun owner, why would you ever have that position? It makes no sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think I really want to applaud the mayor because it's not an easy voice in the Republican Party, and he should really be acknowledged for his courage. This is wonderful to hear. And what's very frustrating is there are a number of other things we could be doing to keep guns out of the hands of criminals that respect people's right to have a gun if they're a law-abiding citizen. And I'll give you 2 examples. These are easy fixes. And I confess they're my bills, but I just want to give you more examples. If you're a federally licensed gun dealer and your license is revoked because you've sold guns to criminals and you haven't filed the right paperwork, under current law, your entire inventory of 200, 300, 400 guns is deemed your personal collection. And then you can do what you want with it, include sell it to people without background checks. So you reward a gun dealer who violates the law. So I put in a bill that's very simple. If you're a federally licensed gun dealer and your license is revoked, you can only sell your inventory to another federally licensed gun dealer. A pretty simple fix. Again, there's some terrible examples of what has happened in those instances where guns were sold. And second example is that there are a number of pieces of legislation that fix our broken background check system, that just make sure that people actually have a background check. But there's a real problem in this country because, and this was the Charleston loophole, if you go into a gun store to buy a gun and the answer is not provided in 3 days, and the vast majority of them are, but the answer is not provided in 3 days, the gun seller can sell you the gun. It's called the default purchase because no responses come back. Between 2010 and 2015, about 15,000 guns were sold to prohibited people, which meant criminals and other people who should not have bought the guns. And so that's happened, and virtually nothing happens to those people. And so I've introduced a piece of legislation that says when that happens, notice should be provided to local law enforcement, the state police for the jurisdiction in which it occurred, so that they can at least make a decision. Let's go and arrest this person who bought a gun illegally, who's in possession of a firearm against the law. And again, this is focusing on, okay, let's focus on the criminals, the people who shouldn't have guns, which this bill that I'll introduce today does the same. And so I think if we can just try to appeal to some common sense and say, okay, we respect your right to possess a firearm. It's in our Constitution, but we know you agree with us that we should do everything we can to keep the guns out of the hands of people who shouldn't have them. And we're not powerless we're not powerless. We actually can do things that will reduce the numbers of deaths in this country, reduce gun violence by reducing the number of criminals and others who shouldn't have guns who have access to them.
If I could make this is a completely different point,
Yeah.
but I just wanted to say that one of the things we found was that, and we are certainly not the only people who pointed this out, but that lone wolves really are the sort of the terrorist of the day. That means people who operate on their own or essentially on their own. So it's not like during the Civil Rights Movement when a Klan leader ordered the death of a certain NAACP leader or that kind of thing. These people are operating on their own by and large. And my point about that is simply that if you are operating on your own entirely, if you're Dylan Roof, if you're relatively unsophisticated but murderous in intent, a gun is the thing that you're going to get. It's easy. You don't need to talk to other people about how you're going to put this bomb together without blowing yourself up. It's not an elaborate plot at all. You simply, like Dylan Roof, can walk into a church and start murdering people. So I just think there's a connection that's increasingly important. I think you mentioned in your study we found something like 57% of the people, of the domestic terrorists in about 6 years, the first 6 years of Obama's administration, had used guns. Another 5%, I think it was, had used guns and explosives. So I don't have real historical data, but I am certain that that's gone up and up over the past decades. Just that.
To Mark's point earlier about the impact of Trump, I'm reminded of the fact that when Trump was beginning to toss out members of Black Lives Matter and others who were speaking at his protesting at the rallies and encouraging the crowd to do violence and to toss them out. Around that same time was the shooting at the Black Lives Matter protest rally in Minneapolis, in which four people were shot in November. So that connection, again, from the larger political atmospheric and then the capacity for lone wolves, in this case, for people to act. And, I don't know if there's a connection here, but, there's, since November, there's been, I think, a decline in the activity that I've seen around the Black Lives Matter protests. So the potential chilling effect on free speech, sense of the fear of coming out in crowds and being, potentially shot.
And in that case, those guys weren't planning to shoot anyone particularly, but the fact that they had guns with them when they were kind of confronted as spies in the crowd, allowed them to turn around and start trying to murder people.
Well, and that reminds me too of when there were demonstrations in Baltimore, and you had folks show up to help the police, armed with open carry activists, armed with their assault rifles, who were coming to kind of. In my view, it was a counter protest, right? And it's the same kind of notion where you have people armed with firearms approaching situations that are part of this social movement right now. And really, what is the impact of that? And particularly when you have all of these instances where people are actually firing their weapons, I would imagine that the chilling effect of that is pretty substantial.
I think probably half the people at the late Bundy standoff in Burns, Oregon, would have been prohibited from having weapons had your legislation been in place.
And so one of the things that's we talked about in the report a little bit, and I'm curious, Mark, and maybe Mayor, you as well. One of the challenges is in actually securing convictions under hate crimes laws, because these crimes do involve not just demonstrating that somebody engaged in particular conduct, but that they did so with a particular state of mind. And my understanding is part of the problem that we have with the data is in people identifying themselves as victims of a hate crime. Do you have any thoughts about kind of how we can improve the enforcement mechanism so that we have people actually being successfully charged and prosecuted with hate crimes when they are committing them?
Well, I mean, it's a problem. And the problem is that it is easy to show that this person punched that person in the nose. It's much more difficult to say, why was that? And, from a prosecutor's point of view, from a police officer's point of view, and oftentimes the penalties aren't really that different, particularly when you get up to murder and that kind of thing. So do they really want to go to all the trouble to establish why exactly, what was the guy thinking, what was the person thinking when they pulled the trigger? That said, the FBI recommends, and this would solve the problem if it were in fact done, that what police officers ought to do, these ought to be reported as ostensible hate crimes, no matter how it's prosecuted. And there's no connection in the law between how it's ultimately prosecuted and how it is reported to the FBI. But training is very lax. There was a period when quite a lot of officers were getting training in the late 90s in hate crimes and bias crimes and so on, but that's not so anymore. So the reporting is just terrible. And I don't say that to attack the police, and certainly not the FBI, which merely compiles numbers provided by the states. But as you said, I mean, the idea, that Mississippi and Alabama routinely report one hate crime per year each is ludicrous. And I can say, as a matter of fact, living in Alabama, that there have been years when the state has reported one hate crime when we know absolutely, of 10 or 12 major hate crimes, murders and that kind of thing. So, another piece of the problem is that communities and states don't like to report a lot of hate crime because they're afraid of being sort of portrayed as, sort of hate central, right? The most hateful place in, Alabama or the country and that kind of thing. So there are a lot of problems. The only thing I can say, vaguely wise about it is that the officers on the ground need more training to recognize these things. The National Crime Victimization Survey, which is the way the Bureau of Justice Statistics looked at hate crimes to get a truer measure of what was happening out there, asks people if they've been the victim of a hate crime on the basis of some pretty simple evidence. Were words said or were there symbols left that indicate that kind of bias? And if so, it gets counted, at least in that survey, as a hate crime. And I think that gives us a much better sense of what's really happening out there.
Yeah, and as an elected official, I don't have that legal standard. So the thing I clearly remember is when we had our shooting, we had Jasjit Singh from SALDEF and Amardeep Singh from the Sikh Coalition came in and said, this is a hate crime, you need to call it that. And that's what I did. Elected officials shouldn't be afraid to call something what it is. We benefited from the fact that we didn't have to prove it. Our shooter killed himself after he was wounded by one of our officers. But again, call it what it is. Don't hide behind it because of the legality of, well, we can't talk about anything that's going to jeopardize the case. Nonsense. If it looks like a hate crime, it probably is. And maybe if we took a more progressive stance on it, we would actually get some more prosecutions, and people that would be are committing these crimes would be identified as people that are doing those types of things. And so, again, you have to be involved in the process and not be afraid. There's way too many elected officials, and the congressman, I'm sure, would agree, that are not brave. They live election. They're there for whatever reason they're there, but they're not real brave men or women. That has to change. If you're going to be elected official, you got to stand up for stuff, and especially when it's something this important, and actually do something about it. Don't just talk about it. One of the things that frustrates the hell out of me is people that just talk and never do. That's not a way to do business for any elected official.
In a kind of related vein, I find it incredible that after the Charleston massacre, the director of the FBI, who's not elected, but said this was not domestic terrorism, and that is incredibly difficult for me to understand. I can't even understand the thinking behind it. As everyone in the room knows, Dylan Roof went into that church to start a race war, quote unquote, right? You're raping our women and taking over our country. This was not merely an act. He didn't get angry in some bar and shoot, an unfortunate black man who happened to cross his path. This was a deliberate act meant to do exactly what terrorism does, right? It's an attempt to influence public policy in a very large way. It's not merely an attempt to rub out a few of your enemies.
Mayor, you mentioned that it was really important to you as the community was responding to what happened at the temple, that it not define your community. And Mark, one of the things that you said is one of the harms caused by a hate crime is that it does have the potential to fracture a community along kind of some pre-existing lines of difference. And so how did the Oak Creek community respond to this, and did you find that there was that tension within other members of the community?
We didn't have a lot of people, the people that were people that may have agreed with some of these actions. Hopefully we don't have any of those kinds, but there's probably some out there. We didn't have they don't come forward. What I was impressed by was the types and kinds of people that came and said, we're with you, we stand with you, we support you. When I looked out over at that audience of 6,000 people, they were every color, every faith, every group you'd see. And we're not a particularly diverse community, although we're getting much more diverse because we're in Milwaukee County. But some things came out of this, right? A dialogue with all of our faith groups. So now every 3 months I hold a faith summit. We have 26 places of worship in our city of every color and flavor. So we bring them together and we talk about not their faith so much, but community. What can we do to help? It was startling to me. We have a Coptic church that's in the city of Oak Creek, right on the freeway, that was on a terror watch list. I didn't even know that until the shooting at the Sikh temple. They were actually on that list before that. And they had measures in place to protect them because of their location, because of the fact that they're persecuted in Egypt as Christians. Very, very tense situation. The Sikh temple, in most cases, was kind of quiet. People knew they were there, but they didn't really get involved. Since that's changed. So if there's the way that I'm impressed with the way the community came together, they support each other. So when we have these faith summits, we get people from all different groups, and people just walk in and they want to hear this conversation, and it actually builds stronger communities. That's how you get past some of this stuff. If you let things fester, they will become problems, and we tried not to do that. We would not let that define us, and now we're one of the fastest growing cities in Wisconsin with like $1 billion worth of development in the next 3 years coming. That's a good way to turn things around, right? You're doing real things with jobs and all that stuff. That's how you get stuff done, and that makes people, as bad as that situation was, people want to come to Oak Creek. So that tells me we did something right.
No, I mean, Oak Creek is a model, really, for, how, I mean, the fact is that despite all the terrible things we've said about what hate crimes do to communities, there's also the potential to, not to speak in cliches, but to sort of make, lemonade with lemons. It really can work, and it really can be a kind of a basis for opening a dialogue that, you never would have thought about,
Absolutely.
Presumably, until that happened.
And-
I mean, maybe it's worth saying, though, that perhaps if they were Muslims and not Sikhs, it might not have been quite as easy to bring the community together. I think that's just sort of reality out there.
Well, hopefully it bodes well for this legislation and other legislation at the state level. If people in communities are concerned about hate crime, the rise of hate crime, this could be seen as sensible legislation, and I'm sure that's what we all hope for as an outgrowth from these horrific incidents.
So I want to give a chance for the folks who are joining us today to be able to ask questions too of our panelists. And we've got, I think Brendan's got a mic, and so if anybody has a question and wants to participate, please let me know. Yeah. And, can you introduce yourself to everyone?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Alejandro Butel. I'm researcher for countering violent extremism at the University of Maryland's START Research Center. That's the study of terrorism and responses to terrorism. I just wanted to add a quick data point and maybe get your additional commentary on it. Last year, our organization released a report looking at the use of firearms in terrorist incidents in the United States from 1970 to 2014. And one of the things that stood out from our findings, which was derived from our global terrorism database, which has over 140,000 different terror attacks around the world, including those in the United States. But what it found was that when we looked at the use of firearms in terrorist attacks, the average, I have this here, the average percent of lethal terror attacks not involving a firearm was only 4%. But when it involved firearms, it jumped to 40%, 40%. So I'd just like to get your comments and your thoughts on that additional finding there in terms of the nexus potentially between firearms and lethality of terrorist attacks here in the United States.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I think that speaks to really the heart of the concern that we have about firearms in the wrong hands, which is exactly that a firearm is an extremely lethal tool that is easy to use in order to achieve that result. And Mark, I don't know if that's...
I mean, I just say
comports with-
what you say seems to back up what we're saying very much. I'm not sure there's much to add to it except that it's good data and over a long period of time. So, I think that connection is real and exactly the reason why we're sitting here.
And the other thing that I would add to that too is, we have a number of gaps and loopholes in our gun laws. Probably the biggest of which is the one that allows people to buy firearms through private transactions without a background check. And so not only are guns extremely effective as a tool of terrorism, but they are extremely easy to obtain. And so I think those two things together is probably a lot of what drives the research that you found. Yeah. Awesome. Yeah. My friend in pink. Hi.
My name's Colleen Allen, and I work for a education association. And this doesn't have anything to do with research or just observation. I feel like the topic on hate and guns, in a broader, conversation, is really a conversation about race that needs to happen in this country. And not to be too provocative, but a lot of what you were sort of getting at is the fact that as the demographics change, white people are afraid Obama's going to take their guns away and their white daughter's going to marry their black lesbian lover. And I feel like from the polling I've seen, most of the country agrees that guns should be, that the Second Amendment can be continue to be in effect, but guns should not be in the hands of people that, and I don't understand, other than the backing of places like NRA, that the legislation won't go through. If you're representing your constituency, then the guns should not be in the hands of the wrong people.
Yeah, I mean, I think a couple things. One is the president made this point when he announced his executive order on in some important ways to help reduce gun violence in this country. And it's a really important point to remind people, and that is that the NRA was once really a membership organization that represented hunters and sportsmen and women. And it is essentially a gun manufacturing trade association whose real objective is to make sure as many guns as possible are sold to produce tremendous profits for the gun manufacturing industry. I mean, it's really, so you see this disconnect between even NRA members and the leadership of the NRA on many of these issues. The members of the NRA support background checks. They support efforts to keep guns out of the hands of criminals. So it's really this disconnection. And it's, you know, it's sort of, we need to pull the veil off and say this is a gun manufacturing association really advocating for policies, and they shouldn't be setting gun policy in this country. But the question of why is it that that doesn't translate into action by Congress, to me, is not only enormously frustrating, but very hard to explain. Because the reality is, you know, lots of people blame the NRA for Congress's failure to enact common sense gun safety legislation. I don't blame the NRA. I blame the members of Congress, and particularly the Republican leadership that won't bring these bills to the floor. Because this town is filled with very powerful special interests who lobby on all kinds of issues, but it's the responsibility of people who have the privilege of serving in Congress to stand up and vote and do the right things on these issues. And so, yes, are they effective? And, you know, their strategy has been really very effective. It's basically saying to people, do not look at the merits of this piece of legislation. Understand this is the first step to taking your gun. And so they don't have to actually defend, like, how could you be against my bill about gun dealers? Like, that's so common sense. How could you be against background checks? I mean, it's if you train people to hear that as whatever it is, don't look at the merits of it. Understand this is the beginning, the slippery slope. They're coming to take your gun. And they have been successful in basically sort of making that case and avoiding accountability for why they would oppose something. But the truth is, the final point I would make is that I think that we are only going to see progress on this issue in the Congress of the United States when outside groups that are doing a magnificent job continue to kind of press. This is going to be where people are going to be held accountable for not doing it, where people are going to demand, you have to do this, and if you don't, we are not going to reelect you, or we're not going to support you, we're not going to contribute to you. And I mean, there has to be accountability, and people who are standing in the way need to be thrown out of office, and people need to see that. But it really has to be, and you know, there's been a lot of great work from CAP and every town and lots of great advocacy groups that are building this outside momentum. But my very final point is, I think for a lot of us, and I don't know how you fix this, who care about responsible gun safety, for a lot of people on the progressive side of politics, it's on our list, along with education and women's health care and the environment. And it's one of 5 important priorities. And I think for people who oppose responsible gun safety legislation, for many of them, it's the only thing on their list. And the intensity at which they both vote on that issue, contribute on that issue, mobilize on. And I don't know how we change that, because that's sort of not how we're wired. We care about lots of things. But somehow we've got to figure out how to hold people really accountable who stand in the way of responsible gun safety legislation.
If I could make one point about just guns and race, a couple of brief points. You know, maybe it's worth remembering that some of the very first early and successful efforts at gun control came in California under Ronald Reagan, who was responding to the sight of Black Panthers in Sacramento demonstrating on the steps of the Capitol with long rifles, right? So then, when it was the black man with a gun looking scary, rather than the 3%ers or the Oath Keepers or the guys in Burns, Oregon, the public was very much behind it. The other point I'd like to make is the NRA has kind of played on the race aspects of this in a number of different ways. It's worth remembering that in the fall of 2008, when Barack Obama was already the presidential nominee, the Democratic nominee, that the NRA, along with a couple of gun manufacturers, ran a massive campaign called Prepare for the Storm. You know, they didn't exactly say sort of the Negro is coming for you, but that was, you know, right in the subtext. And, you know, of course, the NRA has continued to sound, you know, the alarm about essentially conspiracy theories, right? Obama has a secret plan. You know, it's not merely to limit gun, you know, close the gun show loophole or whatever it may be. He actually wants all of your guns. You know, and that is an idea that is directly connected to the militia movement, to the so-called patriot movement. The people and groups like the 3%ers and the Oath Keepers and the various militias around the country, the Bundy Gang and so on, they believe variations of the following conspiracy theory. The United States is about to impose martial law. probably with the aid of foreign troops, very likely UN Blue Helmets, that immediately afterwards the government will come for the guns of every private citizen who's not an armed sort of thug of the state, that anyone who resists will be thrown into concentration camps that have been secretly built by FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Agency, which is not so good at handling hurricanes, but apparently very good at running concentration camps, and ultimately will force the United States into this sort of socialistic New World Order, right? The one world global government. So, that's the NRA playing to the extreme right in a whole number of different ways, in terms of race, in terms of very far right-wing and far-out conspiracy theory. So
Just real quick to the woman's question about, this fear of the unknown, right? I don't know these people, so I must fear them. That's communication. And like I was talking earlier about hosting this event, you have to get folks together that typically don't meet together. We are a country of people that go to work, pull in their driveway, garage door goes down, they sit there and watch the same channel on TV for like 6 hours, go to bed, repeat that every day of their life. That is not a recipe for getting to know your neighbors. So you have to work to do that. You have to host events. You have to be willing to be a community of any size, small to New York City, to do things that bring people together. And it's not easy sometimes, but I always say in all my presentations, it's really hard to dislike someone that you've gotten to know personally. I don't care what they look like or what their story is. Their family situations are exactly the same as yours. They have kids that act like idiots sometimes, and they have the crazy uncles. It doesn't matter what faith you're part of. They all have the same story. Once you've established that, that can multiply amongst way more people, and then you start to break that down. This story is not going to change. As you mentioned, 2043, it's not going anywhere, so you might as well figure it out. Because if we don't figure it out, we are going to have serious problems. And as I said in my opening remarks, the rhetoric that I'm hearing is not helpful in any way, and it will actually make it worse. And I will not forget that, and I will be more vocal to people that say those types of things, because that's, frankly, nonsense.
There's a Harvard professor, Robert Putnam, who's done some work that shows that as diversity increases in a society, trust goes down both within ethnic groups and between ethnic or racial groups, which is not, it sounds like maybe a condemnation of multiculturalism. That's not what Putnam means, but what it does mean, and what he says explicitly, is just as you're saying, Mayor, that, as a society becomes more diverse, which we are unquestionably and inevitably becoming, sort of like it or not, it is more and more necessary to do bridge building, to do exactly the kinds of things. I was on a panel just last night in New York. We were discussing similar kinds of things, and the way, and a lot of the discussion was around the idea that 30, 40 years ago, we sort of had shared experiences, right? People of all different kinds of stripes, fought in the war against the Nazis. There was a much more, we watched the same news shows, read the same facts in the newspapers, and that is just not true today. And a part of that, of course, is the shape of the media, right? This incredibly splintered scene where you can believe anything in the world. You can believe the UN or the conspiracy theory I just told you, and believe me, there are plenty of news sources out there who will tell you you're exactly right. Dylan Roof is, again, a great example of that. It's a kid who, very much in the internet generation and the sort of social media generation, who's got all his information electronically. Didn't read the newspapers, didn't read the magazines, focused on this website that told him that black people were destroying America, destroying sort of white America.
You must have had, it's a good question, because you get a lot of respect.
Brendan, help me out.
Hi, Charlie Crocker with Picture Motion. I'm working on a film about Newtown. So my question is, you mentioned how you need to call things what they are. It seems that it's really easy to convince Republicans to work on terrorism issues. Why is there not a stronger push to call gun violence terrorism, hate crimes, to start framing that rhetoric into actionable items?
Well, I think actually we saw a recent example of that, and it didn't change the results. There was an effort in the House to prevent individuals who are on the terrorist watch list from being able to buy a gun. Now, this means it has been determined that they are too dangerous, these individuals are too dangerous to get on an airplane, but apparently not too dangerous to go into a gun store and buy a gun. And we tried, again, that was very much framed in the idea of preventing suspected terrorists from buying guns. And even that, in that context, we were unsuccessful in persuading our colleagues on the other side of the aisle to close that loophole. So I think there's a lot more discussion about it, but I think it is still the case that this American devotion to gun ownership is so strong and so connected to this sense of protecting myself from whatever this conspiracy is or whatever other threat I perceive, that we've tried that, but I think we'll continue to see more of it, but it didn't do the trick, so to speak.
At the same time, I mean, sort of one-on-one gun violence isn't really terrorism. I mean, I think it kind of muddies the definition. And what I'd say, kind of related to what you said, though, is that there's been an obvious and marked reluctance to call white American terrorists what they are, right? And thus, the director of the FBI's reluctance to describe Dylan Roof as a terrorist. It's maybe worth remembering that in the 90s, the FBI absolutely, as a matter of policy, refused to describe the murder of abortion providers and their escorts as terrorists. And it's classic terrorism, right? You're not merely killing the doctor, you are discouraging doctors and women everywhere from taking advantage of their legal rights. So that really is terrorism, and it has changed. We've seen it sway back and forth after Oklahoma City, of course, in 1995. That was kind of the wake-up moment for law enforcement and a lot of politicians. But then, 6 years later, along came 9/11, and it seemed to fade very quickly into the background. So there's been a constant back and forth, including with the Obama administration. The Obama administration, a year and a half ago or so, held a CV, a Countering Violent Extremism conference at the White House, and they kind of said all the right things in the lead up to that conference, meaning we're going to be looking at all kinds of terrorism and so on. But, my boss, among others, was at that conference, and, it was all about jihadist terrorism, period. So that's a problem.
Hi, my name is Stephanie Berry. I'm retired, and I've been looking at, where I want to put my efforts, and I've looked at gun violence and the Brady campaign, et cetera. And what I'm hearing is that my gun, because I'm law-abiding, is a good gun, and that it's safe and it's not dangerous. It's okay to do. Why is that message a good message? I just don't hear a counter message that explains why guns aren't solutions to our problems. Because we're saying if I'm law-abiding, it's a solution to my problems or some problem. But the guy who used it for the hate crime is using it inappropriately. That's what guns are for, to kill people.
Well, one statistic to be aware of is 80% of the weapons used in mass shootings over the last 30 years were purchased legally. So there's a problem even in the current system because people who shouldn't have guns are getting them. So I think, it's one thing to say I'm a law-abiding citizen, I should get to have my gun, absolutely. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't continue to work very hard to keep guns out of the hands of people who shouldn't have them for all the reasons we talked about. Fixing the background check system, making sure people who are dangerously mentally ill that having a gun is a danger to them or others, or people who have committed a hate crime or committed some other act of violence which makes it more likely that they will engage in some additional violence with a gun. So I think there are things we can do to keep guns out of the hands of people who shouldn't, and the fact that the vast majority of people who have a gun are law-abiding citizens who don't use it illegally is great, and that's a good thing, but it doesn't mean we shouldn't make an effort to try to keep guns out of the hands of people who shouldn't have them. I agree.
Well, there is a little bit of a counter-narrative. I mean, you know this better than I. Is it the Coalition to Stop Gun Violence that has found, you're 43 times more likely to be shot by your own gun in your own house than to stop a burglar or, some attacking person?
I mean, I hear this stuff all the time. I have people argue that they want to carry guns into church and they want to carry guns into the fast food place. Yet, I'm reading stories where they leave their guns unattended in the bathrooms of churches, and then, frankly, they're not even prosecuted for doing that, which is mind-boggling to me. Again, it's about responsibility. We can't throw the Second Amendment out the window just because we don't like guns, right? It's a reality that we live in. So I live in the real world. That's the reality we have to face, right? So there are people that are law-abiding gun owners, and there's people that aren't. As the congressman said, we got to go after these folks that shouldn't have them and make it really hard for them to get guns, because that's not the case now. You look at Milwaukee has not had a very stellar year last year they had a horrible year for violence. Murder rate way up, carjackings, robberies committed with a gun. They're getting these guns illegally. They all have records, and frankly, they're not going to jail for doing the things they're doing. We got to fix that, and the way to do it is to get these guns away from them, and that's not an easy thing to do. No one should be of the mind that this is a simple problem. These are decades solutions, right? Communication and education are the two pillars of how this gets fixed. Communicate with each other so that we don't hate each other, and education from a young age to not grow up hating someone because they look differently. Those are long-term things. It will happen, but in the short term, we have to do real things that are actually realistic, that we can change the dialogue, change how people have access to guns. If we don't do that, it's not going to be pretty until those long-term solutions can actually have some effect.
My name is Bob Bates, and I'm on the board of the Brady campaign. And I totally agree with this lady who talked about messaging, because we in the GVP movement use the same language that the gun activists use. Someone up there this morning used the term legal guns. A legal gun is just as lethal as an illegal gun. And so the messaging that GVP groups use is the same as the messaging that the activists use. And it seems to me we need to be able to change the wording and change the dialogue in our favor instead of continuing to allow us to use their language. There are 330 million guns in our society and like 320 million people. Most of us don't have guns, so somebody's got a heck of a lot of guns. And then the rest of us are gunless. I just think that we need to figure out a way to accept and acknowledge that there are already too many guns in our society. And this notion of being a legal gun owner is almost irrelevant, because you just said the presence of these guns causes people to have accidents, causes people to allow guns to be in the hands of kids and other folk that are a result of careless ownership.
Yeah, I want to just respectfully push back a little bit. I do think that's a fine argument to make for people to say we don't like guns, we think there are too many. But if we're talking about how do we affect change and how do we encourage people to come to a place where they'll agree to vote for and support meaningful gun safety legislation, I think we will lose the argument of guns are bad, people shouldn't have them, because there's a constitutional provision that actually authorizes it. And that's a fight which I think we can argue about, and whether you like guns or don't like guns is an interesting academic discussion. But what I think we have to do as policymakers and advocates who want to affect change is make arguments that will actually convince people to vote for and enact responsible gun safety legislation. And I think the best way to do that is to say we recognize the Second Amendment gives people the right to have a firearm. But what we want to focus on is how do we prevent gun violence by keeping guns out of the hands of criminals and others who shouldn't have it. If we solve that piece, it won't completely solve the problem of gun violence in this country, but it will be a huge, huge part of addressing this scourge of gun violence in America. And then we can talk later on about whether we should have guns at all. But I think if you start with we shouldn't have guns, there are just too many, you will never get anyone to listen to the rest of the argument about these very reasonable common sense measures that most Americans support. So I think it's...
Congressman, you yourself said that they are now using language that doesn't allow them to listen to your reasonable argument. And so what I'm suggesting is that we need messaging that gets to the same kind of point that they're making on the other side.
Yeah, I'll just say one thing that I tested just in my own kind of conversations with gun advocates is if you say to people, look, I recognize the vast majority of Americans own a gun, are law-abiding citizens who have it for the defense of themselves and their family. That's actually, I think, a fact. Now, if you say that, then they'll say, okay, this person understands me. But I think we can agree that we have to do everything we can to keep guns out of the hands of criminals and people who shouldn't have access to firearms. Then my experience is people will at least listen to the second argument. But if you don't acknowledge that first statement, I have found it very challenging to get anyone who is a gun advocate to even consider looking at a bill I have. Now, we still haven't been successful, so maybe it's time to completely revamp that. But I do think those of us that have been fighting for responsible gun safety legislation do it at our peril in terms of success if we don't acknowledge the reality that both we have a constitutional provision that authorizes it and lots of people who live in rural areas of this country who believe that it's necessary for the defense of themselves and their family. That's a reality for them and for their experiences. And so if we can get those folks to say, okay, accepting that you're a law-abiding citizen that has it to defend yourself and your family, don't you agree with me, though, we can do a lot more to keep guns out of the hands of criminals or people who are going to be dangerous for them. And then it's hard for them to say, well, no, because now I'm not talking about them having it. I'm talking about criminals and people who are going to do things that they shouldn't be doing. So that's just, maybe I've been beaten down having done this work for 15 years. But
just to argue the negative, if you want to really flare things up, it's to make a already entrenched group who doesn't trust anything about the government. They will become more entrenched if you start talking in those, I think, in those kind of terms. Doesn't mean it's right or wrong. You certainly have the right to your opinion on it. That's just the reality of what I come from, a very conservative gun-owning state. And I respect the people's right to own guns. But if I go the other way and say, you know, some of the things you're saying, it's not going to help the argument.
Maybe we can get them into the middle ground then. I mean,
Well, that's all about nuance. I said it in my opening comments.
one extreme, and then we've got the other extreme. Maybe that's the way, Congressman, to get the legislation passed that you like.
Thank you. I know there were some other folks who had hands up. I want to make sure that we've got time for a couple more. Oh, okay. One of the congressman's constituents is here as well, so we have to make sure that she gets the next question.
My name is Fred Bonig. I actually used to have my FFL. I turned it in 1995 when my customers started saying they wanted to buy caseloads of SKSs and steel core ammo, and I guess when the Soviet bloc went down, all that stuff was available. I thought, no, I don't want to be in this business anymore. But I will say one thing that I think you're hitting on, but you're missing, is that this isn't the same as it was in the old days when you actually could make sense with people and say things that were truthful and they would listen. That's just nonsense, because that doesn't work. It's obvious. You have a senator out there right now saying that we can't put in a Supreme Court judge because he's going to take away the Second Amendment. I think what would work probably better, and I found it to work pretty well with my own case of dealing with congressmen, is publicly shaming them. Senator Tom Cotton, that man won't talk to me again. But the point is, if you shame them and really make them look ridiculous, because that's what they're doing to the common sense people right now. I mean, you have people running for president that are saying such ridiculous things, but people are actually listening. I think shaming them for ignorance, and I think you have a whole room of the choir here, but the people that are the problem aren't the choir.
Go to my friend in purple over here.
Thank you. I'm proud to be your constituent.
Thank you.
And thank you all for the work you do. And I had two comments. One is that I agree with this gentleman back here. I mean, I think we've been too easily accepting of that the Second Amendment means everybody can own a gun. It's for a well-armed militia. These are not well-armed militia people that own guns, most of them. But second of all, I'm wondering, none of you commented, and maybe it's because these attempts have failed in the past, of holding gun manufacturers liable, because that's what's worked with tobacco companies, that's what's worked with the car companies.
I would like to take a crack at that, because I've thought about what could be the counter narrative coming out of my background in human rights. Under human rights law, there's the state's duty to protect its citizens, and that's not an army and a navy. That's, the capacity for your daughter to get to school without being shot. And there's a countervailing narrative to be created there, I think, around this affirmative obligation to protect and any citizen's right to be secure in their safety of person. This is 50 years of human rights law that backs that, right? A couple of years ago at the UN, there was discussion about gun violence, and it's interesting that it's been creeping up in international forum discussions, whether it's the UN Human Rights Committee or the United States in its recent periodic review on the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. These issues have been emerging. And it ties to the manufacturers and where there might be some other interesting veins of opportunity. So take, for example, Glock Industries. It's an Austrian company. You know, they ship 67% of their product to the United States. And they're not passive. They join with the NRA, as Mark was pointing out, how manufacturers then join in terms of defeating legislation, joining in litigation. But, you know, the citizens in Austria read, you know, in horror what happens in the United States, but they have no sense of the complicity of Glock Industries in that behavior. And if we can get to the point where we begin to put pressure, you know, on you know, we live in this globalized economy. You have guns that, it's Glock, it's Taurus out of Brazil, it's Sig Sauer, which is a Swiss German company. So you have these you have these opportunities, I think, that we can, if we find the right levers to begin to put pressure on some of the manufacturers, perhaps outside of the country, to begin to come into this country. And what we say to Glock is, look, we're not saying that you can't sell your product in the United States, but we want you to support reasonable gun legislation, because no child in Austria has ever had to practice an active shooter drill in his or her middle school. And we just simply want the same protections for our children here as Austrian children have there. And I think that's a very simple, powerful argument that we can build support globally in ways that we really haven't channeled that potential. And that's part of, I think, the counter-narrative that needs to be created.
Can I just add two little things to that? One is, I think there's an opportunity, particularly when you look at smart technology and advances that are being made in this area, that we could use the same sort of consumer standards for safety and demand more of the kind of design, et cetera. But part of that is also made more difficult because the federal government is still precluded from collecting research about the consequences of gun violence as a public health reality. And I mean, it's, I think, the only area in the federal government that is specifically prohibited from, I mean, think about that, where, you know, the government can't collect information to inform us as we develop policy. So I think, you know, undoing those two things and using this consumer model is a great opportunity.
I mean, think about what other product can you cite where the producer of the product does not care about the end result of what happens with the product. It's just mind-boggling that's the case. And if I was running the NRA or any group that was pro-gun, I would certainly, in a spirit of goodwill, I would try to figure out ways to make the community safer, given that the guns are there, given that there's 330 million guns or whatever. I'm going to do something to make people safer, because one of the reasons I don't talk about gun control, I just talk about gun violence. There's an end result of whatever interaction there is with people and guns. There's got to be something that group could do to make people safer. What is that? And let's work on that. So even with a group as entrenched as that, there has to be some ability to mine something positive there. And that's my hope going forward, that might happen.
We do two more? We'll do two more.
Right.
Hello. I'm Deborah Snyder, and I came in from Stafford, Virginia. I'm retired. And the comment I want to make follows what this lady just brought out about manufacture. Can everybody hear me?
Yep.
Manufacture and just the economics of supply and demand. And the reason I'm mentioning it is two things. The Honorable Congressman, your work in wanting to bring back assault weapons ban on military-style weapons puts the idea of it grouped with a hate crime, that seems to be the tie-in, because Adam Lanza was not a terrorist, even though he committed one of the most horrific crimes that I can remember in my lifetime. It wasn't because of the nature of his state of mind. Now, a hate group might use somebody like that as sort of a Manchurian candidate, but if you, for instance, contrasted San Bernardino with Paris, ISIS did not consider San Bernardino on the same level as Paris, France, because in America we have the lone wolf. We are all about rugged individualism, and I don't mean to ramble on. I think my point is, in 2005, and I went on the CAP website to find this out, there was a Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act passed. And the piece dated in January 15th of 2016 quotes that it granted broad immunity from liability to gun owners, gun manufacturers and dealers. So going on the economic model, who has the incentive to have all these crates of weapons that private individuals in this country are buying? And we are being terrorized with it on many, many levels. On many levels. And incidentally, just on the mentally ill cannot own here. Well, who is mentally ill? Define mental illness when there are HIPAA regulations that means we cannot go into anyone's medical records. It's a big, big mess. It's a big mess. And we will not survive it unless we really pull out all the stops. Public health, emergency, that aspect cannot be ignored either.
Thank you, and thank you for raising the gun industry immunity law, which we fondly call PLACA. That's another area of kind of absurdity of American law, which is that the gun industry enjoys almost complete immunity from civil liability for the misuse of its product. And so, it's hard to even talk about in a reasonable way. It's kind of so, it's so amazing. So that's another
amazing in a bad way.
Amazing in a bad way, exactly. So that's another piece of kind of the issues that we're dealing with. Brendan, let's take one more question, please. Maybe my friend right back here in the middle.
Hi, Jose Carrillo, student from Ohio State University, and I have my question is, when it comes to common sense legislation, I was wondering if there's anything being done to treat the root of the problem, not just the symptoms. For example, any common sense measure that is proposed to reduce gun violence is dead on arrival in Congress. We have people in the legislature who are strict interpreters of the Constitution, only when it's politically expedient, of course, and the only reason they offer is that they defend the Second Amendment, or that they are that they believe in personal liberty from the government. I was wondering if there's any measure to get people in our legislature to maybe disclose who their support is coming from. I think if we had our legislators disclose that the NRA is funding their campaign or offering them things in exchange for favorable votes, then maybe those senators and congressmen might lose some of the credibility they've been given. Then I think we might get to the root of the problem and not just the symptoms, which the symptoms are gun violence.
Well, I would just say, sadly, I think people actually do know who the NRA is funding. That's public record, the money they spend and contribute. And frankly, there are colleagues that I have that wear the NRA endorsement and support of that organization. They list it on their campaign literature. They talk about it because the places that they represent, they see that as an important qualification. And so I do think, we absolutely should do more and do complete campaign finance reform and build in much better transparency and have a public financing model. I've a lot of responses to that, but I don't think it's the notion of people don't know who the NRA is supporting. I think they actually do. I think it's actually, to Stephen's point, is we have got to counter this argument about the constitutional amendment. I was a mayor, and the most difficult calls you ever get is when someone was killed, particularly a young person, and you have to tell their family. It's just, and I think, when people talk about the constitutional amendment and the right to have, I think the response to that also is, my constituents also have a constitutional right to live free of gun violence, to be able to sit on their front porch with their grandchildren on a summer night and enjoy a summer evening, and to be able to walk their children in a park and send their kids out to play and know that they're going to come home. So there's a constitutional right at stake too, and that is the right to live in a community free from the scourge of gun violence. And I just think be reminding people that there isn't, there are other countervailing and I would say more important protections about living free and free from violence that are also being compromised because of gun violence in this country. And I think there is something here. I'm not sure how we sort of tease it out, but I think that is something people need to hear.
I could just say one thing. I think the naming and shaming is absolutely right, and that's very much the tactic we use at the Southern Poverty Law Center in general. And the fact is that on the NRA side, right, they do wear it as a badge of honor. And I think, for instance, the idea that the gun companies were given immunity, the idea that the CDC is prohibited from doing public health research on guns, that's outrageous beyond words. I mean, it's just incredible. And the people who back that, I guess it's too late now, but those are the kinds of people who ought to be isolated and shown to be the nuts they are, the extremists they really are. And just that. I think that's, obviously the NRA has done, God help us, a very good job over the years of making it very, very difficult. But, you think about some of the things the NRA has done. You remember the jackbooted thugs? You remember when the elder Bush quit the NRA because, all of federal law enforcement was being described by Wayne LaPierre as a bunch of Nazis? I don't know why that didn't stick, but it should have. And maybe it's up to people like us in this room to make those kinds of things stick.
The woman right there has a quick question.
It's not necessary for the NRA to play to the nut crowd all the time and to play up hatred and paranoia and such. They also use their money to attack proponents of sensible gun legislation without ever mentioning guns. Attack ads can attack a candidate on environmental regulation, on foreign policy issues, on things that have nothing to do with domestic gun policy. The whole intent, though, is to keep that candidate from getting elected. They're much more insidious. They're not as clumsy and obvious as we think they are. So it's sometimes not so obvious where their money's going.
Yeah, so I'm sorry. I have to wrap and let our panelists go. So
one really quick, because there are a lot.
Have a microphone, and I can't stop you. But please, just very quickly, please.
There are a lot of young people in this room, and they do a lot of research online. And if you do any research online, the first 150 websites are owned and run by the NRA and supported, so you're not getting your research. You've got to be really careful. You have to go beyond just going online and looking it up.
Thank you. So thank you so much, and clearly this is a conversation that could keep going. I really want to thank everybody for being here. I really want to thank our panelists and all of you for being here today. Thanks so much. Yes, please, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Great.